April 15th, 1848. Washington, District of Columbia. Shortly after midnight, 77 people are hiding in the belly of a ship. They are not cargo. They are human beings, pressed together in the pitch-black hold of a 54-ton schooner called the Pearl, scarce daring to draw breath, listening to the dark Potomac River whisper and murmur against the hull below them. Some of the smallest children have been given drops of laudanum to prevent their crying from carrying across the water to ears that ought not hear it. Among those 77 souls, lying side by side in the absolute stillness of that hold, are two sisters. Mary Edmonson is 15 years of age. Emily Edmonson is 13. Their hands, in all likelihood, are touching. For a few hushed hours, it seems as though Providence itself might grant them their deliverance. The Pearl slips down the Potomac under the cover of night, bearing what will become the largest attempted escape from bondage in the history of this republic. But foul weather stalls the vessel before she reaches open water. And by morning, Washington's slaveholders know. 35 armed men commandeer a steam vessel and give chase across the Chesapeake. The Pearl is overtaken. The fugitives are dragged from the hold into the gray morning light, blinking, exposed, disrupted from the fragile dream of freedom they had dared to hold for 3 whole days. The armed men bind their prisoners with rope 2 by 2, synchronized in their cruelty, deliberate in their efficiency, as men who have performed such acts before and feel no particular urgency to examine their conscience about it. And when the procession arrives back into Washington City, the crowds line the thoroughfares. Not in sympathy, in celebration. They jeer, they throw refuse, they shout imprecations. And through the noise and the humiliation of that procession, Mary and Emily Edmonson walk, bound, exhibited, surrounded, back into a city that has transformed their bid for liberty into a public spectacle. Mary is 15, Emily is 13. Within the fortnight, a man named Joseph Bruin will pay $4,500 for them. And it is then, in the weeks and months that follow, that the story, in all its unsettling and persistent darkness, truly begins. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories history tried to bury. The city was still humming with excitement from the Pearl's recapture when the Edmonson family was separated and distributed among its prisons. Washington had a particular talent for this kind of arrangement, the efficient, synchronized processing of human grief. Papers were signed, locks were turned. Families who had been pressed together in the whispered darkness of that schooner's hold, who had spent 3 days at sea murmuring prayers, their lives intertwined in ways that no document and no ledger had ever been designed to measure, were now divided into cells and corridors and inventory entries, as though the love between them were nothing more than an administrative disturbance to be resolved. Mary and Emily Edmonson found themselves in a stone room with barred windows, through which the fragrances of the city drifted in, bread baking somewhere nearby, the scent of the river at low tide, the intoxicating and deeply unnatural contrast of ordinary life continuing in full, luminous daylight just beyond those walls, indifferent to everything happening within them. Their father, Paul Edmonson, was a free man. I need you to understand what that meant, and what it nonetheless did not mean. Paul Edmonson had been born into bondage and had purchased his own freedom through decades of persistent labor and deliberate, careful saving. He was a man of profound dignity, of deep Methodist faith, who had spent his life attempting, one child at a time, to recover what the law had taken from him. He had already purchased the freedom of 4 of his older daughters. He had paid the going market price for his own flesh and blood because the Ashford of that era, the entire established structure of Southern law and custom, required him to do so and offered him no other instrument. He was free, but his wife, Amelia, had remained enslaved. And in the monstrous arithmetic of that era, the legal condition of the mother determined the condition of every child she bore, regardless of the father's status, regardless of his freedom, regardless of every fragment of natural and moral claim a father might make upon his own children. Which meant that every one of Paul Edmonson's 14 children had entered this world as property, not as people, as property. Paul stood outside the jail walls and could not reach his daughters. He stood on free soil and could do nothing. A guardian, a man who had whispered promises to the Edmonson family, who had assured them he would hold the children in Washington and would not sell them south. This guardian did not keep his word. He contacted a slave trader named Joseph Bruin, and he sold all 6 of the Edmonson children for $4,500. When Paul Edmonson received this intelligence, he fell to his knees in the street. His establishment sat at 1707 Duke Street in Alexandria, Virginia, a brick building of federal style, its facade presenting nothing to the street that might disrupt the composure of a passerby. No extraordinary sounds escaped its walls. No unsettling evidence of its commerce was visible from the thoroughfare. From the outside, it murmured nothing of what transpired within. Bruin had operated his establishment since the early 1840s. He was known throughout the trade, in the slave markets of Natchez, in the auction houses of Vicksburg, in the commerce that moved along the great Mississippi waterway like a dark current beneath the surface of ordinary American prosperity, as a man of thoroughness and of cold, synchronized ambition. He had a specialty. The traders of that era whispered of it as fancy trade. It referred to the sale of young enslaved women, women selected for youth, for appearance, for the particular contrast of their complexions, lighter in many cases than the buyers expected, a detail that the traders noted with the same detached precision a merchant applies to the grading of cotton. Sold not for domestic labor, not for field work, for the gratification of men in Natchez and Vicksburg and along the Mississippi plantations, men with money enough to purchase a human being for purposes that no polite vocabulary of that era would name directly, but which every man in the trade understood with perfect, unpleasant, deliberate clarity. Mary Edmonson was 15 years of age. Emily was 13. Both sisters possessed complexions, luminous, pale in ways that the trade found particularly valuable, that Bruin had noted in his ledger with the same ink he used for every other inventory entry. And he understood, with the experienced eye of a man for whom human beings had long since ceased to register as anything other than fragments of potential revenue, exactly what Mary and Emily Edmonson were worth in the New Orleans market. Their father, Paul, made one approach. He presented himself at Bruin's office in Alexandria, walked through that door that murmured nothing from the outside, into the interior that whispered everything, and asked, in the name of every fragment of human decency still remaining in that building, what sum would purchase his daughter's freedom. Bruin looked at him across the desk, a man of Ashford certainty, of Rowley confidence, unmoved and unsmiling, and named his figure. $2,250. If the sum was not produced within a fixed number of weeks, Bruin would ship Mary and Emily south on the next available packet vessel, to New Orleans, to Natchez, to Vicksburg, to whatever market along the Mississippi offered the highest return on his investment. Paul Edmonson walked home with nothing but the number, and the knowledge, hushed and devastating, of what it meant. The structure was known among enslaved people throughout the Chesapeake region as the Georgia Pen, a name whispered in the quarters of Maryland and Virginia plantations with the particular hushed urgency reserved for things one fears but cannot avoid knowing about. Brick walls, a yard of bare, packed earth, no shade, no tree, no shrub, no fragment of mercy in its architecture. The midday sun poured down upon those confined within with the unsettling thoroughness of an environment designed not for human habitation, but for human storage. The Edmonson children were held there for 4 weeks. 4 weeks of waking each morning in whispered uncertainty, not knowing whether this would be the day the wagon came. 4 weeks of watching the gates with the persistent, flickering attention of people who understand that what they are watching for will not announce itself. 4 weeks of their father's face not appearing in the yard, because Paul Edmonson could not enter those walls, could only stand in the street outside and know his children were within, and be unable nonetheless to reach them. Then they were transferred to Baltimore, to a pen kept by Bruin's associate, a man described by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who would later document these fragments of history with her own deliberate hand, as a man of coarse habits, constantly using the most profane and brutal language. A man whose curiosity about the suffering of those in his charge had been extinguished long ago, and whose persistent indifference to that suffering had by now synchronized itself so completely with his daily professional routine that it had become, for all practical purposes, invisible to him. 3 more weeks passed. The calendar advanced with its own cold, deliberate synchronization, indifferent to prayer, indifferent to Paul Edmonson's anguish on the other side of those walls, indifferent to everything except the departure date that Bruin had entered into his Mississippi ledger with the same neat, unhesitating ink he used for every other transaction. Mary and Emily Edmonson understood, as enslaved people learn to understand the rhythms of a system that holds them, reading its signs the way a navigator reads the disturbance of water before a reef appears, that the departure was coming, that when it came, it would come without ceremony. A door would open, a name would be called, its sound hanging in the still air of that yard like a fragment of sentence that could not be taken back. And that would be that. They had watched it happen to others in that yard, the stillness that followed a name called, the unsettling finality of a door closing. They understood what it meant. And in those 3 weeks in Baltimore, in that brick pen with its coarse keeper and its atmosphere of hushed, persistent dread and flickering uncertainty, 2 young women arrived at a decision that no ledger would record, a decision that would cost them more than most human beings are ever called upon to pay, a decision so deliberate, so precisely synchronized with the single vulnerability of the system surrounding them that the men who ran that system would not understand what had happened until it was too late to reverse it. Now, I want you to set aside whatever you are holding, dear listener. I want you to be fully present for what I am about to tell you. Because what happened next was not impulse. It was not the spontaneous expression of distress that the keepers of such establishments had learned to wait out with confident patience, knowing that the body's own urgency would disrupt any resolution the mind attempted to hold. It was strategy. Cold, clear, precise strategy. Devised in hushed conversation, perhaps, or perhaps in the wordless synchronization of 2 sisters who had known each other's minds since before language was necessary between them. In the stillness of a Baltimore pen, by a girl of 15 and her sister, aged 13. In the first hours, the response was dismissal, the easy, confident dismissal of men for whom the entire architecture of their professional lives rested upon a single, reliable foundation. "They will eat," said the course keeper. "They always do." The body, deprived of sustenance, makes its own argument for compliance. The traders of that era had built their entire methodology of management upon this argument. In all their years of moving human beings through the synchronized machinery of the domestic slave trade, from the plantations of Maryland and Virginia, down through the auction houses of Natchez and Vicksburg, along the great deliberate current of the Mississippi commerce, they had never known it to fail. The first day passed, and Mary and Emily Edmonson did not eat. The second day passed, the third, the fourth, the fifth. The flickering confidence of the keeper began, in small and reluctant increments, to murmur of doubt. And now, dear listener, I want you to hold in your heart the full and unsettling weight of what this required of them. Because this is the fragment of the story that no ledger recorded and no document preserved, the part that lingers in the imagination of anyone willing to be truly, fully present for it. Hunger, in its accumulated form, is not a philosophical condition. It is not the abstract principle of a woman who has arrived at a deliberate decision in her mind and finds that decision comfortable to sustain. It is a physical force, persistent, advancing, intimate, whispering at first and then insisting, then demanding in a language the body understands at a level far beneath the reach of any conscious resolution. The trembling of the hands, the dizziness that arrives without announcement, like a disturbance in the inner ear that no act of will entirely corrects. The weakness that settles into the limbs with the deliberate thoroughness of floodwater finding its level. The escalation of the body's argument, quiet on the first day, louder on the third, a murmur becoming a cry, becoming a roar by the fifth, insisting that no principle, no loyalty, no love is worth the unsettling physical reality of what it is doing to itself. The traders had built their system upon this insistence. And yet, here were two young women, their lives intertwined since birth, their bond synchronized so deeply that even the men who held them could see it flickering between them like a quiet, persistent flame. And they were not relenting. What had they perceived, these two young women, that every man in that establishment had failed to perceive? They had perceived the single fragment of vulnerability in a system that appeared from every outward angle to be impregnable. The system required them to remain valuable. Value, in the whispered language of those Mississippi ledgers, in the deliberate commerce of Natchez and Vicksburg and every slave auction house between the Chesapeake and the Gulf, depended upon health, upon strength, upon the visible, physical condition that the Hutchkins of that trade, the fundamental justification for any price, the essential basis of any transaction, required to be present and demonstrable. The Hutchkins of the system, the essential core of its arithmetic. A healthy young woman entered into the ledger as prime and first-rate, and no known defects commanded a high number. A weakening young woman commanded a lower one. A young woman too visibly diminished, her face hollowed, her luminous quality faded, her strength no longer synchronized with the physical expectations of a Natchez or Vicksburg buyer, commanded nothing at all. And so, with a precision and a deliberateness that the Ashford of their trade had never been designed to anticipate, they turned the system's own arithmetic against it. Every meal refused was a sentence written in the only language those ledgers could read. Every day of visible decline, the hushed alteration of the face, the slower step, the whispered transparency of a person sustained by nothing but will and purpose, and a love so intertwined with their very identity that to sever it would be to sever the self, was a message, delivered directly, without ambiguity, to the men who held authority over their lives. The message was this: separate us, and you shall have nothing left worth the selling. Bruin received fragments of intelligence from Baltimore that did not synchronize with his expectations. He traveled north. He stood in that yard in Baltimore and looked at two young women, entered in his Mississippi ledger as healthy and prime and first-rate, who were, by every visible evidence, no longer any of those things. Their faces had acquired the particular quality of those sustained by something other than food: hollow, intent, a luminous, unsettling stillness behind the eyes that was not the stillness of defeat, not the hushed resignation he had seen before in that yard, but the stillness of absolute, deliberate purpose. Something flickered in Bruin's expression. Not mercy. Let us be precise. Not a fragment of mercy. Uncertainty. Because an uncertain asset is not a reliable asset, and an unreliable asset disrupts every calculation that follows from it, disrupts the synchronized, deliberate machinery of a trade that had operated on the premise of predictability for longer than either of these young women had been alive. He had planned to ship them separately, 2 separate sales, 2 separate buyers, 2 separate prices, each one individually higher in the markets of Natchez and Vicksburg and New Orleans than any combined price a paired sale could command. Standard practice, deliberate efficiency, the Rowley of the trade, the established, accepted, never questioned methodology of a commerce that had synchronized itself over decades into something resembling a science. But the plan had encountered something that no plan in that establishment had previously encountered. 2 sisters who had decided that the plan was not acceptable, and who were demonstrating that decision persistently, silently, at an escalating personal cost that no man in that building had imagined 2 young women capable of sustaining in the only language available to them. Not words, not tears, not the desperate whispered pleading that the system had always known how to dismiss. Hunger. The deliberate, synchronized, persistent diminution of the very thing the system valued most: their own bodies. Bruin stared at them. He calculated. And the calculation, for perhaps the first time in all his years of synchronized, deliberate Mississippi ledger commerce, did not come out in the ledger's favor. He could separate them, as the Ashford of that trade demanded, as every fragment of precedent in his establishment required, as the deliberate arithmetic of every ledger he had ever maintained insisted. But to do so now, with these 2 young women in their present condition, the essential Hutchkins of their market value draining from them day by persistent day, with no assurance of restoration before the Natchez and Vicksburg buying season closed, was to accept a loss he had not budgeted for. A loss whose escalation was visible and ongoing. A disruption to the synchronized machinery of his business that he had not anticipated and could not, now, easily correct. Or he could sell them together, as one lot, as the intertwined, inseparable pair they had declared themselves to be, at a cost to themselves that he had not imagined possible, through a strategy so deliberate and so precisely synchronized with the single vulnerability of his operation that he would spend the remainder of his career, one suspects, not thinking about it. Because thinking about it would require acknowledging what had occurred. That 2 enslaved girls of 15 and 13, with no advocate, no document in their favor, no fragment of legal protection, no Belmont of comfort to retreat to, no Rowley of powerful friends to intercede, had walked into the single undefended place in the entire machinery of his trade and had refused to leave. He stared at them. The stillness in the yard was absolute. Then he made his decision. The decision came without ceremony, without acknowledgement, whispered or otherwise, of what had transpired within those walls. Without a single word from any man in that establishment that something had happened here that the entire synchronized Ashford of their trade had never been designed to confront. The ledger would record what ledgers always recorded: a date, names, a price, a destination. The clean, deliberate notation of commerce concluded, its fragments organized into columns, its murmurs of human reality silenced beneath the weight of ink and paper. It would not record the hunger. It would not record the escalating, unsettling deliberateness of two young women pressing upon the single crack in an impregnable system until the system, nonetheless, gave way. It would not record the whispered conversation, or the hushed, wordless synchronization of two sisters who perhaps needed no words, in which Mary and Emily Edmonson understood what they were going to do and what it would cost them, and chose to do it anyway. It would not record the night when Emily reached for her sister's hand in the stillness of that Baltimore pen, and Mary held on, and the flickering flame between them, that intertwined, luminous, persistent, unsettling to the system flame, did not go out. The ledger cannot hold any of that. It was not designed to hold it. But we can hold it. We, who are listening now, in the hushed hours of this night, at this great distance of years, with all the fragments of knowing that those years have given us, we can receive this story and give it the place it deserves. Two sisters, one lot, one destination, side by side, as they had been through everything, through the pitch-black hold of the Pearl, through the ropes and the jeering crowds of Washington, through the Georgia pen and the Belmont heat of Alexandria and the Baltimore pen and the weeks of deliberate, costly, persistent refusal. Side by side, not divided, not remotely. Bruin shipped them aboard a packet vessel departing Baltimore for New Orleans. The voyage took 20 days. Storms beset the ship. Provisions grew short. The enslaved people in the hold, who had the least to begin with, suffered this shortfall with the particular thoroughness of those for whom there is no alternative. When the vessel made port at New Orleans, Mary and Emily were marched to a showroom along the Mississippi waterfront, where buyers from Natchez, from Vicksburg, from the great plantations of the Belmont country and the Rowley parishes sat at their ease and inspected the assembled human beings with the same detached curiosity a merchant brings to a bolt of fabric. The plan for the Edmonson sisters had not changed. Bruin still intended to sell them as fancy girls. He displayed them on an open porch facing the street in the luminous heat of a Louisiana summer, where the scent of the Mississippi drifted in with the afternoon air, intoxicating and indifferent, fragrant with distance, carrying no whisper of mercy for those standing in that heat waiting to be purchased. And then, yellow fever struck New Orleans. The epidemic arrived with the unsettling swiftness of all great disruptions, without announcement, without the courtesy of warning. Bruin, unwilling to lose his investment to disease, sent the sisters back to Alexandria, where their father Paul was waiting, on his knees, alive and waiting. Bruin named his final price, $2,250, to be paid within a fixed period. If the sum was not produced in time, the sisters would be sent back south permanently. Paul Edmonson did not have $2,250, but he had something else. He had the story. and he had legs that could carry him to New York. He was directed to a minister, a man named Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, pastor of Plymouth Congregational Church in Brooklyn, whose congregation was known for its abolitionist sympathies, and whose sister, a woman named Harriet, was at that very period writing a novel whose fragments would shake this nation to its foundations. Paul Edmonson stood before Reverend Beecher and told him everything about Amelia, about the 14 children, about the years of deliberate saving, the persistent effort to purchase freedom one child at a time, about the Pearl, about the Georgia pen and the Baltimore pen and the 20 days at sea and the showroom in New Orleans, about $2,250 that stood like a locked Belmont gate between his daughters and the fate Bruin had synchronized for them. Reverend Beecher listened. Then he stood before his congregation on a Sunday morning and told them what he had heard. And Plymouth Congregational Church, those luminous, deliberate people of Brooklyn, opened their purse. The money was raised. On the 4th day of November, in the year of our Lord 1848, 6 months and 19 days after Mary and Emily Edmonson had hidden in the hushed, whispered darkness of the Pearl's hold and prayed for liberty, that liberty was purchased. They were free. Mary Edmonson enrolled at Oberlin College in Ohio in the year 1853. 6 months after she arrived, she fell ill with tuberculosis, that persistent, unsettling disease that had already taken so many young lives in so many cold northern rooms. She died at 20 years of age. She had been free for 5 years. In those 5 years, she had stood beside Frederick Douglass at a convention in Cazenovia, New York, and spoken, in her own deliberate, luminous voice, against the Fugitive Slave Act. She had attended college. She had made use of every fragment of every day she was given. She was 20 years old. Emily Edmonson lived to be 60. She married a man named Larkin Johnson in 1860, built a home in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, and spent the remainder of her long life working, persistent, deliberate, synchronized with the larger movement of her people toward justice, for the rights and advancement of those who came after her. She remained in her final years neighbors with Frederick Douglass himself, 2 old survivors on the same street, in the same city, in the same country, that had once entered their names into a ledger and assigned them a price. Emily Edmonson died on September the 15th, 1895. She was buried in Anacostia, on free soil, on soil that had never, not for a single whispered day, recognized her as property. On the very ground where Joseph Bruin's slave pen once stood, where the brick walls and the bare yard and the unsettling absence of shade had once been arranged with cold architectural deliberateness to remind the people held within them of what the Mississippi Ledger said they were. The statue is 10 feet tall, cast in bronze. 2 sisters, standing side by side, as they always were, as they refused, through hunger, through the persistent diminishment of their own bodies, through the deliberate and unsettling application of the system's own arithmetic against itself, to stop being. If such a document survived in a form that could be found and read, you would see what ledgers always show: a date, names, a price, a destination. The clean, deliberate, synchronized notation of commerce concluded, its fragments organized, its murmurs of human reality silenced. You would not see the hunger. You would not see the days when the body's escalating argument must have been nearly unanswerable, and was nonetheless answered. You would not see the whispered strategy devised in the stillness of that Baltimore yard, the deliberate synchronization of two sisters who had looked at the most powerful, most unsettling machinery of human exploitation this nation had ever constructed, and found, within its Ashford certainty and its Mississippi Ledger confidence and its Rowley and Belmont and Natchez and Vicksburg commerce, one flickering crack, and pressed upon it until it gave way. You would not see Emily reaching for her sister's hand in the hushed darkness of that pen. The murmur of fingers finding fingers. Mary holding on. Neither of them letting go. The ledger cannot hold any of that. It was not designed to hold it, but we can hold it. We, who are listening in the whispered hours of this night, we can receive these fragments and give them the honor they are owed. Because what Mary and Emily Edmonson did was not a small thing dressed up in the luminous language of history to appear larger than it was. It was exactly as large as it appears. It was an act of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary love, deliberate, synchronized, persistent, carried out in the stillness of a brick pen in Baltimore by two young women who had been told in every possible way that a society can tell a person that their bond was a disruption to the system's arithmetic and could therefore be dissolved. They disagreed, not loudly, not with the kind of resistance that gets entered into any document as resistance, but with the hushed, flickering, unsettling, relentless certainty of women who understood something that every man in that building, with his Mississippi Ledger and his Ashford confidence and his synchronized machinery of exploitation, had never once considered. That a system built entirely upon the assumption of compliance can be disrupted by two people who simply, persistently, deliberately refuse. It preserves transactions and not the human beings behind them. It maintains ledgers of what was bought and sold along the Mississippi between Natchez and Vicksburg and New Orleans, but rarely of what was felt and known and whispered in the hushed hours before the buying and selling commenced. So it falls to us, to those who receive these fragments and carry them forward, to supply what the document left out. To say, these were not entries in a ledger. These were women, sisters, human beings of full and irreplaceable worth, whose lives were intertwined so completely that no system, however synchronized, however deliberate, however ancient in its Ashford certainty, could divide them. To say, what they endured mattered. What they chose mattered. Who they were to each other mattered. And to say, finally, this, that the will to stay together, hushed, persistent, costly, flickering in the darkness of a Baltimore pen like a flame that no brick wall and no iron door and no Mississippi Ledger could extinguish, is one of the oldest and most luminous forces this world has ever known. And that Mary and Emily Edmonson, in their hunger and their stillness and their absolute, synchronized, unsettling refusal to accept the terms being offered to them, demonstrated something that no ledger, no system, no Ashford of power, and no Rowley of profit has ever been able to permanently contain. That love, when it is real enough and brave enough and deliberate enough, can make even the most powerful machinery in the world pause and murmur of doubt and give way May we remember them as they deserve to be remembered, not as fragments, not as entries, as sisters. Follow this channel for more stories that history tried to bury.